might introduce the new people who are joining me here at this stage for this session. Obviously, Mr Bernardi and Mr Westwell are staying, and I have to my right Executive Director for Strategic Policy and External Relations, Dr Peter Smith. I don't have an opening statement. Happy to go straight to questions.
Page 209 deals with most of the budget lines relating to non-government schools. In relation to the provision of funding to non-government schools through the Non-Government Reform Support Fund, as the Minister is aware, this fund provides essential support to the non-government sector to support schools to meet the needs of students with a disability through the nationally consistent collection of data, as well as governance and financial literacy support for board members and NAPLAN support as well. Many smaller, low-fee, low-SES schools rely heavily on the support this fund provides, and the federal government has announced it will not continue, as I understand. What support will the Minister give our non-government sector to seek reconsideration of this federal decision?
I'll have to take that one on notice, Member for Morialta.
Thank you, sir. And in the event the Commonwealth is not persuaded by what I'm sure will be strong representations from the Minister, will the state government consider other ways of supporting our non-government schools?
It will certainly be very strong advocacy for me. I've made it very clear, I think, particularly in the last couple of weeks, that I'm happy to have those arguments with the federal colleagues, regardless of which government is in power at the time. If they are ultimately unsuccessful, then we, of course, will go back and consider what can be done in the absence of that federal funding.
Thank you very much. In relation to the application of both direct measure of income and also to the transition of schools receiving 22% of SRS, even if historically they'd been receiving more than 22% of SRS, as some schools had been, obviously all of those schools that will see a reduction would like there not to be a reduction, but for the most part we'd hope they've had time to make adjustments and that they'll manage. I think the Minister would be aware that there's at least one school that appears to be a significant outlier, a school that serves communities of disadvantage, low fee, faith-based alternative that its families value. Will the Minister give some consideration to providing further transition support to support such a school in those circumstances, as both governments have in the case of the special schools in the independent sector?
Happy to say the school name. Thank you, Member for Morialta. And yes, I understand that there is a case to be made around why the school that I believe you are asking about could be treated in a different fashion, as were Suneden and Aspect, and I'm happy to consider what can be done.
Thank you. In the negotiation of the next National School Reform Agreement, will the government seek to maintain the commitment of successive governments, Labor and Liberal, to funding non-government schools to 22% of SRS?
There's absolutely no plans not to. Let me say that in the my intention is yes, having been there working for a former Premier when that commitment was made and understanding the pain that was gone through to get there. I don't intend on being the Minister who winds that back.
It'll be something to watch. Can the Minister provide a guarantee that the South Australian Government will not seek to remove current exemptions for payroll tax and the like from non-government schools, as your colleagues in Victoria have recently done?
comment I might offer, Member for Morialta, is I think it probably falls into the purview of the Treasurer, is my advice for Mr Bernardi, but nonetheless we don't have any plans to do that, and the information that I have at this stage, as I understand, Victoria are in the process of maybe reconsidering exactly what that level of support is.
I understand the government has changed the no-interest loans for non-government schools program back to a low-interest loan for non-government schools program. Can I ask how much money will this save the government?
You are correct, we did, and we did it in consultation with the non-government sector. I spoke to both Mr McGowan and it was to Ms Granskins at that stage. Of course, they both said that they would like to have it forever, but I understood that it was going to revert back at some point, and they accepted that, and we have done that. Mr Bernardi, I think, might have some specifics perhaps about.
Thank you. Can the Minister advise what schools have been funded through this program since the election and when the next round opens, or if it's currently open, when it will be determined who has been successful?
Happy to do that, Member for Morialta. Since the election. I'll come back to you with a list of those that have been funded. The scheme will continue with one round per year commencing 2023, and round 4 of the scheme is expected to open in November of this year and close in February of 2024, but I will come back with a list of those schools funded under the program since the election.
Thank you very much. On page 178, it has the list of items that are administered, which includes... Actually, you know what? I'm going to do one other round on this line first, if that's all right. Is the government going to continue providing state government funding towards the chaplaincy program, which I think is now called National School Wellbeing Program?
Yes.
How much is the allocation of state government funding towards the program?
I'll get that for you, but I might just add a comment about the consideration that's being done now is the election commitment from the federal government around offering their money on a basis that schools can choose between faith or non-faith-based providers. So we're trying to grapple with that because, as I'm sure you are aware, providers like SMG Group, aside from the very good work they do it at a pretty low cost. So we have to grapple with what could be a situation where those schools that put their hand up to have a non-faith-based worker, which I totally support, might not come at the same cost as a pastoral care worker. So we're working on that at the moment, but I'll...
Thank you.
You can ask another one perhaps, and I'll come back with an answer on how much...
Every few years, the government, when the national funding is renewed, there tends to be a process where you work out whether the proportions going to each sector will stay the same or whether they'll adjust, and then you go through a process of working out which schools get the funding and whether some will miss out. When is that process going to be completed so we are able to identify which schools will be funded going forward for the next few years?
Just a point of clarification, do you mean the student wellbeing funding boost from the Commonwealth, or separate to that?
No, separate to the boost, the chaplaincy program and whatever its successor is called now.
advice is we don't think there's a change, but we'll get an answer to you before the end of this session.
Well, with that in mind, I'm aware that there are several dozen schools at least that have decided, since the former government made it allowable to use their own funds towards a program, having previously not applied for funding. And indeed, will those schools be considered to now get some of the funding under the new program? And can the Minister confirm that the decision taken to allow schools to use their own funding towards chaplaincy or a broader secular wellbeing program, will that be continue to be allowed? I
am advised, and I recall that we are working on that detail basically as we speak on how that might operate.
And is the government considering altering the funding per school to enable an increase in hours per service to be supported by these funds? To be supported by centrally provided funds.
We'll take that one on notice, Member for Morialta.
Thank you. I have a very couple of one or two questions on the History Trust, then Education Standards Board and SACE.
No problems. We'll switch.
It might not take long. I was going to ask in relation to the History Trust in relation to their accommodation. What's the update on the History Trust's head office, History Trust Towers or whatever it is going to be called, and how long is the new accommodation secured for?
Thank you. I might, Chair, just introduce Mr. Greg Mackey, OAM, who is here on behalf of the History Trust, and I'm happy for Mr. Mackey to make some comments, but there are a few introductory remarks that perhaps I could make too to try to answer the member from Morialta's question. In terms of the new premises in later this year, the History Trust will move from the temporary premises at 77 Grenfell Street into a new premises at Security House, Level 2, 233 North Terrace. Funding of $302,000 was allocated in the 22-23 financial year as part of that budget review to support the relocation. Future additional budget allocations as part of the 2022-23 mid-year budget review to support the increased costs of the relocation to that new premises are in 23-24, $671,000. In 24-25, $686,000. In 25-26, $702,000. In 26-27, $718,000. I'm very happy for Mr. Mackey, if you are okay with that, Member for Morialta, to make any additional comments he would like to make.
Thank you, Minister. The Member for Morialta. I'm pleased to report that we actually achieved the relocation 2 weeks ago, and so we're now in fine digs at Level 2, 233 North Terrace. It's a almost 100-year-old building, Security House, and we occupy the entire second floor. And we're very grateful for the assistance we received by the department, but also the Department of Infrastructure and Transport in relation to design of the fit-out. And it gives us, for the first time in 42 years, a purpose-designed home where we haven't had to be shoehorned into a site that was less than optimal.
Thank you. You escaped the compactors. In relation to the History Trust collections, the Minister for Arts yesterday advised the committee that the original scope of the project had been restored with some work from her department, which is good news. Can I confirm then, in relation to the History Trust collections, the state history collections, that means all of those artefacts that were supposed to be moved in will be moved in when the job is complete? The Minister for Arts also said that the time frame for completing that project had been deferred. Is the History Trust received reassurance that the continued rental you'll need to bear for the as a result of the delay, any increased costs for that will be borne by the the collection storage collection budget and not by your budget?
Thank you, Member for Morialta, and I will have a go at answering all those questions. So DPC and DIT are jointly managing the delivery of the new dedicated and combined cultural institution storage project, which was announced by the former government in the 21-22 state budget. The project does sit, as you identified, with the Minister for Arts, and the History Trust State History Collection remains a part of the project scope. That is good news. I think we can all agree. I understand the Minister for Arts provided information to you yesterday, to which you alluded, about the scope and timing. The History Trust has informed me that DPC have opted to renew the lease on one site that houses parts of the collections of both the History Trust and SA Museum. In terms of costs, at this stage, neither DIT nor DPC, I believe, have advised the History Trust of any lease cost increases that will impact its operating budget when the current lease concludes. And anything else I have not answered, I'm happy to take on notice and come back to you.
Thank you. ESB?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mackey. Chair, if I could introduce Kerry Lever, who is the Chief Executive of the Registrar, in fact, both the Chief Executive and the Registrar of the Education Standards Board.
Welcome. Again, same page, same reference. Is the government proposing to make amendments to the Education and Early Childhood Services Registration Standards Acts, and if so, why?
At this stage, I have not been advised of that. If that changes, I will provide an update.
Can the Minister guarantee that ESB services will continue to be provided on a cost recovery basis or less, and that schools or services will not see increases in their regulatory costs?
Member for Morialta, I think the information I can provide is that nothing has come to me yet to suggest that is what's going to happen, but Ms Lever informs me that the ESB itself is reviewing the fee levels because they have not been changed since the Act came into effect, but there's nothing with me at the moment to suggest that that is imminent, but I'll await advice from the ESB around what they are proposing and make a decision based on that.
Has the government received requests from the ESB for extra state funding to meet its regulatory responsibilities?
Yes, we have, and I think we are familiar also with the recommendation made by the Royal Commissioner in the interim report around that, and I certainly acknowledge the very important work of the ESB, and it has been an issue as long as I can remember, dating back to 2011-12 around funding for the ESB in order to enable it to do its important regulatory role and get out there and do those assessments and investigations of sites. We are, or have currently assisted, or in the process perhaps of assisting the ESB with seconding some staff from the Education Department over there. I might pass to Dr Smith to talk a bit more about that.
Through the Minister, so we are supporting the ESB with the recruitment of 3 staff. 2 have been identified and we're just looking at the 3rd, with the 2 we have identified due to start in the next few weeks.
And are they staff that will still sit on the Education Department payroll, or is it an in-kind contribution?
That's right.
Has the Minister received warnings from the ESB in relation to the standards of care in government OSH services?
Well, in some cases, yes. I do get briefed on those as the Minister, of course, and of course a number of those, when they are government sites, will flow through the Incident Management Division as well, and then there is some cases where the ESB will take compliance action and go through that process, and I am informed by the Chief Executive / Registrar about that action when it occurs. We obviously take that very seriously. It is an important role. I think we are in the process at the moment of, from a department perspective, writing to sites to remind them of obligations under the Act and what they must do, and doing everything we can to ensure high levels of compliance with that. I think that's, yes.
Thank you. A couple of questions for SACE to finish off.
Okay.
And perhaps while the advisors are changing, can I ask a question that Mr Bernardi might be able to help you with? Page 209, near the bottom of the page, there is a $306,000 transfer from contingencies listed in 22-23. Are you able to advise what that's for?
Okay, so I shall put Mr Bernardi on the task, and perhaps we could then, while that is being done, could I introduce Chair Ms Michaela Bensley, the Chief Executive of SACE, and we could pop to a question there so you get to use your time and then come back to Mr Bernardi.
Very good of you. Can the Minister advise what funding is the government providing towards the proposed learner profile for South Australian students, and how that will work in relation to ATAR?
Thank you, Member from Morialta. I'll pass over to the Chief Executive for some comments on that.
Yeah, hello. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, no additional funding for the capabilities work in the learner profile, notwithstanding the funding that was provided in response to the Stage 2 review, which focused on the implementation of an entrepreneurial capability and foregrounding that within the SACE. And so those funds are continuing to be used to utilise that work, particularly in the rollout of our 2 new subjects.
And do you expect that there will be a learner profile pilot at some stage, utilising the resources you already had? Would you care to put a time frame on when you think that'll be potentially available?
Yeah. We've begun that work in response to the Stage 2 review. So we've been working through 2 pilots with schools now around the foregrounding of capabilities, and then have built a visualisation, which is the learner profile, to help support the conversations that happen between teachers and students around the growth of those kind of capabilities. We're in pilot 2. We expect there to be subsequent pilots. I think the focus over the next couple of years will be how we foreground those capabilities within our subjects, and we're working with the system to better understand how the assessment of those capabilities will actually work so that it's fair, valid and reliable, such that we can certify it. And then the place within the SACE of the learner profile is something that we're working with schools on over the next few years. So it will be progressively implemented.
Cool. Do we have a report from the returning officer, or?
I do. Through the Minister.
Yes, yes.
So the 306,000 was to pay for TVSPs in the 22-23 financial years for the Reg Board.
For which one?
The Education Standards Board.
Okay. Can I ask, in relation to international SACE, can we get an update on the marketing of the operation of SACE International over the last year? Have we still got the same take-up from our friends overseas? Has it improved or declined? And are there any targets for its expansion in the coming year or years?
The last 3 years have been really challenging with education, particularly in the international marketplace. A range of our schools have actually still been in COVID lockdowns for the last 3 years, which has put obviously pressure on our growth agenda. We've been focusing primarily on growing and developing the numbers within our existing schools, rather than branching out into new places or new ventures at this point in time. We do have a growth agenda, but we're actually having to work in partnership with schools to realise what that looked like in the changing nature in terms of its competitiveness and the impact of COVID over the last 3 years.
Do you have information in relation to the profitability of the SACE International for the SACE Board? Is there I remember Professor Westwell was enthusiastic a few years ago about its expansion and what that would mean in terms of funding itself. How is that tracking?
It would be tricky at this point in time to actually have a real baseline, because the baseline has changed so much over the last 3 years in terms of the take-up of those numbers. I'd be able to come back more fulsomely in terms of the revenue that it raises for SACE, but at this point in time we're in a period of recalibrating not only our targets but engaging with schools now that they're starting to open back up again.
Okay.
Sadly, the allotted time has expired, and I declare the examination of ministered items complete. Thank you, Minister. The committee stands suspended until 2 p.m.